All right, so thank you for joining us for the Preparing for Climate Risk in BC, the Northeast Climate Risk Network webinar. My name is Kate Murphy, and I'm also joined on the line by my colleague Jim Vanderwall, both of us from the Fraser Basin Council. I personally work from the Vancouver office of Fraser Basin Council on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and it's territory where I have lived and worked and studied. Just a quick webinar overview. We're going to start with some webinar logistics and then get into introductory remarks and answer the question, what is the Northeast Climate Risk Network? Then Tamsin Mills will lead us on an overview of the Regional Climate Projections Report, which was created by the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium and PINA Sustainability. And Erica Crawford will give us an overview of the municipal vulnerability assessments that Shift Collaborative created. Then we're very lucky to be joined by Carol Newsom from the District of Chetwynd and Victor Shopland from the City of Fort St. John to have a quick panel discussion on their experiences as partners in the network. And I will give a very brief next steps update of the Northeast Climate Risk Network based on the workshop that we held yesterday in Fort St. John, and follow that up with a Q&A period. So a few webinar logistics. Please keep your audio muted. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the question box on your control panel. Feel free to ask them throughout and we'll answer them in the Q&A period afterwards. Any technical difficulties you can either address in the question box or you can email fraserbasin@gmail.com and Jim will help you out either way. So what is the Northeast Climate Risk Network? The origins of the Northeast Climate Risk Network date back to this photograph, which is of a 2017 floods and drought regional climate resilience workshop that was held in Fort St. John and co-hosted by City of Fort St. John and the Fraser Basin Council. Out of this workshop came a conversation about addressing climate resilience in a regional manner rather than as piecemeal municipality by municipality manner. And there are a lot of reasons for addressing climate resilience in a regional manner, including the fact that many vulnerable systems and resources that communities rely on are regional systems, as well as the fact that communities can share best practices on similar threats, which can help save time and money. As well, collaborative planning can aggregate resources and attract funding. And regional collaboration for resilience is better able to incorporate rural areas, remote areas, and address risk at the ecosystem level. And these are just four of many, many reasons that regional collaboration for climate resilience is beneficial and helpful when it can be done. So as a result of the conversations at the workshop and following the workshop, and these benefits that communities could see from having a regional collaboration on resilience, 6 municipalities decided to partner and become what was then known as the Northeast Climate Risk Network. These 6 municipalities are the District of Chetwynd, the City of Dawson Creek, the City of Fort St. John, the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, Pouce Coupe, and the District of Tumbler Ridge. And FBC was decided to be the facilitator and project manager of this network and this project. Funding was sought through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Municipalities for Climate Innovation program and was successful. And there was also funding from the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy and the BC Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, as well as the 6 local government partners. And with this funding, the network timeline to complete a number of goals, which I'll go into, was January 2018 to January 2020. So the last day is actually this Friday. But as I said before, I will have a few updates for you about what we talked about at our workshop yesterday on next steps. So the goals of the Northeast Climate Risk Network were threefold. First, to support the Northeast BC local government partners in preparing for a changing climate and understanding the associated risks and vulnerabilities. Collaboratively address climate risks at a regional and community scale through a peer network. And increase community, public, and private sector awareness of the impacts of climate change. In order to accomplish these goals, there were a number of actions undertaken by the Northeast Climate Risk Network, including first forming this peer network. that we called the Northeast Climate Risk Network, as well as developing and making publicly available a regional climate projections report that was led by the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium and PNIS Sustainability, with a lot of input from municipalities. Shift Collaborative led the creation of a community gap analysis, which was the first step towards a vulnerability assessment, again with a lot of input and help from the municipalities, as well as with assistance from Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. Shift Collaborative also developed these in-depth municipal vulnerability assessments, which again were in collaboration with municipalities, of course. And the final thing undertaken by the network was sharing the findings and lessons learned with councils, the public, and via this webinar. So we are very lucky today to be joined by 4 wonderful speakers, the first of which is Tamsin Mills. Tamsin is a registered professional planner with over 10 years of experience as a planner, project manager, facilitator, and sustainability specialist. Tamsin led development and implementation of the City of Vancouver's original adaptation strategy in 2012 and recent refresh. She has also worked as an independent adaptation consultant with municipalities around BC and with non-governmental organizations and businesses. Tamsin has contributed to federal and provincial adaptation efforts, guidebooks, and risk assessments, and is a board member with SFU's Adaptation to Climate Change team. And Tamsin will be taking you through the Regional Climate Projections Report. Our second speaker today is Erica Crawford, who is a planner and facilitator with over 12 years of experience specializing in collaborative processes for building community resilience and climate change adaptation strategies, and regularly provides design and knowledge translation expertise to support effective stakeholder engagement in risk assessments. Born in Dawson Creek, Erica has had the pleasure of working on numerous stakeholder engagement and risk assessment projects in the region in recent years, including Dawson Creek's flood risk assessment and the Peace Region Agriculture Adaptation Assessment and Plan. She is a co-founder of Shift Collaborative and has a master's in community and regional planning from UBC. Erica will be going over the vulnerability assessments that were created. And our second set of speakers are Victor Shopland and Carol Newsom. Victor Shopland is the General Manager of Integrated Services for the City of Fort St. John. He is responsible for planning and engineering, building inspection, GIS, public works and utilities, fleet management, transit, solid waste, and a myriad of capital construction projects focusing mainly on road construction, water, sewer, and stormwater mainline and facility construction or upgrading. He has been with the city for over 32 years in various roles. Carol Newsom, also part of the community panel, is the Chief Administrative Officer for the District of Chetwynd in Northeastern BC, where she enjoys all the outdoor activities available in the spectacular Peace region. Thank you all so much for being a part of this webinar. I will pass it over to Tamsin to start with the Regional Climate Projections Report.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me, and thank you to our community partners and to Fraser Basin Council for hosting this. I am going to go over the climate projections. I'm going to touch first on a few key concepts, which I'm sure is a review for everyone, and then I'll dive into the Northeast climate projections and some of the related impacts that came up through the vulnerability assessment that we completed. So key concepts. I'm sure you've seen this graph from the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium many times. Oops. What we're seeing here is that climate is naturally variable. We have systems such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and El Nino and La Nina that create this natural variability. But of course, what we're looking at is the overall trend. So the gray line merging into these very colorful lines, which are the IPCC emission scenarios. So the report that I'm going to go into used the RCP 8.5, the red line, which is considered business as usual. And it looked at the time slices of the 2050s and the 2080s. So the RCP 8.5 at 2050 can also be considered the RCP 4.5 or the yellow line closer to the 2070s. So other messages from this graph is that the past is no longer appropriate. So if we're building a building today, the past, it has no bearing on the conditions or climate loads of the future. As well, that these emission scenarios are similar to 2050, and then they go quite different directions. So I looked up the weather for this week in Dawson Creek, and I'm very jealous. It's sunny all week, and it's between +4 and -7. Down here on the south coast, it's been rainy and gray for a long time, and that's what's projected next week. So that's weather. That's the weather that's happening in a certain place at a certain time. And of course, climate is the long-term statistics of weather, and climate varies by location and with time. So this map that we're looking at with a little star close-ish to BC, this is for 2003, and I'm sure many of you will remember Kelowna wildfires were 2003, and you can see that we were warmer than average, and the globe was 1/2 degree warmer than average as well. This is winter 2017. I remember quite well, a lot of shoveling, a lot of snow, and so we were colder than normal, but the globe on average was a degree above the baseline. So really what we're looking at today are those longer term climate trends globally downscaled to the local context. So I have the responsibility today to present for my lovely colleagues at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium and PINA Sustainability on their projections report. The link in the middle of the screen will take you to the projections report that has a lot more detail than what I'll present here. And I'll also mention some of the related impacts that came up through the vulnerability assessment. So I'm going to show a series of maps, and there'll always be two. On the left, it's the historic baseline, which is 1971 to 2000, and on the right will be the 2050s with that RCP 8.5 business as usual emission scenario. So what we're looking at here is September through November precipitation. So we are looking at an increased average precipitation in all seasons, with the largest increases in the spring and autumn months, where on average we can anticipate 30% more precipitation by the 2080s. Summer precipitation is also up 7% by the 2050s, but with normal seasonal variability in precipitation, combined with hotter temperatures, which leads to more evaporation, we can't discount that we're going to have hotter, drier summers in the Northeast in the future. This is the when it rains it pours scenario, which is a common projection across BC. So as the climate warms, more moisture is held in the atmosphere, which leads to more intense precipitation during extreme events. So these maps, the map on the right is showing the wettest 5-day period for the 2050s, and regionally on average in the Northeast, that's going up 17%. What I found quite a striking statistic was that the annual total precipitation on very, very wet days, days where precipitation exceeds the 95th percentile, precipitation on those days is going to increase 35% by the 2050s and 51% by the 2080s. So we're really looking at a lot more rain on those very wet days. So some of the associated impacts include localized flooding and sewer surcharge, strain and stress on municipal wastewater systems, private layouts and dugouts, and damage to key transportation infrastructure, which leads to cascading impacts for medical emergencies, evacuation, supply chain, etc. So the winters are getting warmer. Coldest days are less cold. So what you're looking at on the right here are the coldest days in the winter in the 2050s. And those are going to be about 6 degrees warmer than the baseline period. And the nights are going to be about 2.5 degrees warmer by the 2050s. And by the 2080s in the Northeast, January temperatures are going to feel more like Marches of the past. So one piece of good news there is that heating bills may go down, Heating degree days, which is an indicator for heating demand, will be 18% fewer by the 2050s. We're also going to have fewer cold days. So the map on the right is 2050s, and it's showing ice days, which is the annual number of daytime highs that stay below freezing. And that's going to see a 19% decrease by the 2050s. So with fewer cold days and coldest days being less cold, our warmer winters are going to lead to longer potential growing seasons. So by the 2050s, on the right here, we're seeing 30 days longer for the growing season. And on average in the region, by the 2080s, an increase of 40%. So some of the impacts associated with warmer winters include increasing freeze-thaw cycles, really wreaking havoc on infrastructure, increasing pest infestations with impacts to the economy, rain on snow causing all sorts of trouble, and an interesting one, which is effects on dormancy requirements, negatively affecting value of crops as well as wood. So Kate has a poll question now. Okay, yes, that is the correct answer. Increased presence of ticks was not rated a high risk, but the others were. Okay, moving on, increased hot days. So in the past, the region had 12 days on average over 25 degrees, and we're expecting more than a doubling to 40 days by 2050 and 60 days by 2080. So much warmer summers. And by the 2080s, summer temperatures in Fort St. John are projected to be similar to Kelowna's temperatures in the summer of the past. And very hot days are going to increase from 31 to 38 degrees by the 2080s. So some of the impacts related to hot summers that came up were increased wildfire risk, the immediate or direct risk, as well as the indirect impact to community health due to air quality. An interesting one is inability to discharge effluent due to low flow, and increased potential for drought and impacts to water supply still comes up in the late summer. Also going to see changes to stream flow with more precipitation as rain instead of snow. In general, this will mean increased winter runoff, reduced snowpack, and an earlier freshet. So in this graph, black is the past and green and pink is moving forward to the 2050s and the 2080s. So less water stored as snow and melted earlier also means lower summer stream flow, which could be further exacerbated by evaporation. So we're seeing higher stream flow in the winter, a lower and earlier freshet peak, and a lower summer stream flow. Many of the communities in the Northeast have had floods and do foresee impacts from flooding in the future, such as increased costs and capacity for cleanup and restoration, the cumulative anxiety and stress from an extreme event like a flood, impacts to aquatic habitat, and difficulty for water management. Then I just want to cover this category of extreme events. So with those heavier rainstorms, other extreme events such as hailstorms and windstorms are also expected to increase in intensity and frequency, as well as those hazard events like wildfires and floods. So those could impact transportation again, cause power outages, put pressure on volunteers in the community to respond and recover, decrease the durability of infrastructure generally, as we see more of those extreme events, and put increasing demands on municipal resources. So just in summary, oh, we have another poll question. So the question is, in which season is rainfall decreasing in the Northeast? Okay, so the answer is trick question. It's increasing in all seasons. So rainfall increasing in all seasons, with that 7% increase to 2050 in the summer as well. But again, that doesn't mean that the summers are going to be wetter. They could still be drier due to the increasing evaporation from temperatures. So a general trend summary, precipitation, well, there it is again, as well as those more intense rainstorms. So more intensity and frequency of those really heavy rainstorms. Temperatures, we're going to see higher temperatures year round. With those warmer winter temperatures and less frost and ice days, we're going to see longer growing seasons. Summer temperatures above 20 days with temperatures above 25 degrees, more than double by the 2050s, as well as those hot days becoming hotter from sort of 31 to 38 degrees. And then those changes with more rain and less snow impacting stream flow as well. So that's it for a quick review of the Northeast Climate Projections Report, which again can be found at the link in the middle of the screen. And a big thank you to PKIC and PINA for their work on the projections report, and to my colleagues at Shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. That was a great review of the report. And Erica, I will pass it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Kate, and thanks, Tamsin, for setting us up and giving us a good overview of the projections. I'll be presenting on the vulnerability assessment that we did with the communities following up on that projections report, and this is on behalf of my colleagues Carrie Klein and Tamsin, who you just heard from, who made up the team of us who worked on the vulnerability assessment. So as Kate mentioned, the project's been going on for a while. We started this part of it in July of 2018, and there was a few key steps to it. I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So it began with the gap analysis, which led to a community scoping report that was produced for each of the 6 communities. And then the next step was to assess the impacts, vulnerability, and risk. And then following that up with looking at what the adaptation actions would be, and also taking steps to ensure that those results can be implemented. So because, as we know, climate change impacts all aspects of community in ways that are complex and interconnected, we took a collaborative and interdisciplinary approach in how we worked with the network and the working groups that were formed, and also engaging stakeholders in the assessment process. And producing the assessment and the kind of initial action planning that was done is an important tool and background that equips the communities to move forward with this work. But then, of course, the reality of implementing that information and the action ideas is a lot more complex and messy than that. So we were also taking an approach of engaging people the whole way along so that that could build the understanding and capacity to implement this effectively. So speaking about the Northeast region, of course, climate change is not a future event. We're experiencing a lot of changes and a lot of extreme events these days, and the Northeast is no exception to that. This is an example of a few of the things that were identified for the Northeast that have happened in the last number of years. Flooding has been a near annual occurrence, or the threat of flooding has been an annual occurrence, and there's been some very significant flood events, both in communities and in the region. And then, of course, everyone knows about the wildfires, and that had various effects. So already seeing these kinds of events happening in the Northeast today. And the kinds of impacts, Tamsin touched on this as well. There's various ways that this impacts the community. The changing flows and intense rainfall events can impact water supply through turbidity, so that can impact the ability to store and treat the water. Localized flooding, which Tamsin mentioned a couple of times. Extreme winter conditions, and in various ways, so hail, rain on snow, the variability of freeze-thaw events, and extreme cold were all things that communities have been experiencing, and that has a whole bunch of impacts on transportation routes, infrastructure, but also mobility and public safety. There's been also damage to infrastructure and facilities, more stress, these kinds of events like the flooding in town and the way that that has stressed infrastructure systems, and also emergency response capacity. There's been the local events that have happened, but also of significance has been the wildfire response, not directly in these communities, not for some time anyways, but regionally, the evacuation and how that's affecting these communities in terms of response capacity and dealing with people who are being evacuated to their communities. And another one is differences that are being seen in terms of the kind of animal and plant species and the effects of the changing conditions on that. So I have a poll question that Kate will put up for us. Great, so a little bit of everything in there. You're right, those extreme heat events are low on the radar for Northeast communities. Generally, when we talk about the warming conditions, there's some cheers and celebration that happens. And in some respects, the warmer winters as well, although as I mentioned, that's creating some variability and extremes that have also been challenging. But otherwise, all of these things were of concern, and as you indicated as well, wildfire was particularly of concern in the region. And this is these results are from participants in the stakeholder workshops that we did across the region. So the first step, as was mentioned, was the gap analysis that produced the community scoping reports. And so in this, we looked across the various service areas for the community that you can see on the screen here. And the gap analysis provided background from reviewing documents and interviewing people in each community about those service areas to better understand the system itself, looking at what the potential vulnerabilities would be to these service areas due to climate changes, and documenting actions that are already being taken to reduce vulnerability, whether or not that was for climate change specifically. For the most part, it wasn't. However, there's lots that's been going on that does address some of these risks. Also identifying information gaps and opportunities to apply a climate lens. So these themes will probably be becoming familiar to you at this point. So the existing gaps and vulnerabilities included water supply, flood, the impact on transportation networks, changes to species and ecosystems, winter conditions, those emergency events in the region. A couple that maybe haven't been touched on as much are the health impacts and economic impacts. So making sure that we keep those in view, and also infrastructure damage and lifespan. So durability and asset management is something that came up. And at the same time, as I mentioned, there's lots going on in each of the communities that addresses some of these vulnerabilities already. So in the Northern Rockies, sewage and drainage vulnerability assessment specific to climate change was underway. It may be wrapped up now, I'm not sure. That was happening in tandem with this. And also a really strong asset management program that really sets them up well to apply a climate lens. In Fort St. John, a couple of things that are happening due to the regional events. They've become kind of a hub for some of the evacuation, so that's really led to them building their emergency operations center capacity and response capacity. And also they've been doing a lot of work already about stormwater upgrades for a number of years now. Dawson Creek and Pouce Coupe water supply, they've been doing lots of work around watershed management and working on upgrades to the water supply system, so that's reduced risk greatly, and flood risk management as well. They've been doing some really good work around that in the last few years since those floods. Chetwynd also has done a really excellent flood hazard study that took climate change into account specifically. And they've also been part of a regional collaborative to address emergency operations collectively. So that was an interesting one. In Tumbler Ridge, some of the key things that they've done are ensuring backup power for critical infrastructure, and also invested quite a bit in emergency response planning. So there's lots that's being done already. So the next step was to actually assess vulnerability and risk, and we started this. This was building off of the climate projections, which you've heard about now. And from that, together with the gap analysis, we developed impact statements that describe the types of impacts that are likely to affect the service areas in the community. And Tamsin had shared a few of those with you in the last presentation. And then from there, we were looking at, we held stakeholder workshops in each of the communities to both review those impact statements. So we developed those, and then we invited stakeholders in the communities to verify those and to add more detail and change them, or say if it just simply didn't apply. And then we had them engaged in a process to evaluate the vulnerability to each of these impact statements. So looking at both the sensitivity of the system to it and the ability to adapt to that. So that was a participatory assessment that we did with them. And then the third step in that was to assess consequence and risk. So in those workshops, again, stakeholders looked at the consequence across a number of categories for each of those impact statements that were rated high vulnerability. And then we combined that with likelihoods that were generated by an expert panel and came up with these risk ratings. So this just presents those on a bit of a matrix, and the top right is those that are higher risk. And so this was a way of prioritizing which of these, all of these impacts matter, but which of these matter most, which are going to be higher risk, and therefore do we want to prioritize in addressing now. So we took that and also presented this in this format, which provides a description of each of those impact statements, and then the qualitative risk, high, medium, or low, and indicates which service areas would be primarily affected by those, and also provides the scores that were generated for each of those. And this might look familiar. It's modeled after the BC Climate Risk Assessment, the way that they had laid those out, which was very useful. So we've developed these for each of the communities across all of the climate-related hazards. This is specific to the river flood risk. And so those are detailed in each of the summary reports for the communities. And I'll just run through some of the similarities that came out from across the region, and the similarities and then the differences. So again, these will be familiar. So the localized flooding was something particularly due to rain on snow, rapid spring melt, intense rainfall events, and so on, that applied to all communities and came out quite high for most. And water supply for a number of communities was an important concern. Some of this has been is being managed, but it was still something that the communities felt was important to keep on their radar. Wildfires and landslides and the impacts that has on transportation regionally in particular came out for all the communities, and looking at those major events that can wash out or close roads and how that affects supplies getting into the communities, and also the ability of people to access services and evacuate if needed. And then wildfire and flood impact on the health of individuals and the community. So thinking about the impacts on emergency responders, the stress and the impacts of more frequent events, extreme events like this, and also the stress and mental health on community members when these events are repeated. And we're starting to understand that better given some of the large events that we've had over the last number of years. And we have studies now to show that has a large and lasting impact. Some other ones, invasive species and pests, so both the ecosystem and economic impacts, those were of concern in a number of the communities. Managing those extreme and changing winter conditions has been mentioned a few times. Demands on the response capacity, durability of infrastructure. So I've mentioned all of those before. And then river flooding was a similarity across a number of the communities, but not all of them. One of the big differences across the communities was just due to geography. So in Northern Rockies, there was a number of impacts that came up in that process that didn't come up in any of the other ones. So drying muskeg and impacts to ecosystems and industry because of that was one of those. And then also impacts to the traditional access routes and winter roads as conditions were warming. So those were a couple of concern. Further north. And then impacts to agriculture and forestry applied somewhat across the region, but they're more significantly represented in some communities than others. And so there was difference in how that was rated. Water supply was one that was low for both Fort St. John and NRM just because of the local conditions, and also river flooding didn't apply in those two communities either. And then wildfires and the direct risk of those to the community or industry came up for NRM, Tumbler, and Chetwynd, but were lower for others, again, due to the local specificity. So we have another poll question that Kate's putting up there. Just curious about where your communities are at around doing vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning. Great, so we have some, about 20%, yes, we have both. Some have done a vulnerability assessment or an adaptation plan, and a few saying no, but not surprisingly, I don't know was a big chunk of this. So there may be things going on in communities, but it's not necessarily always common knowledge. So I'm not surprised to see that either. Thank you very much for your responses to that. So that gives a sense of the vulnerability and risk assessment that we completed. And then from there, there was this additional step of generating actions and taking some steps to build the capacity to actually implement some of the learning that came from those vulnerability assessments. So what was done after that was to form a climate action team in each of the communities. So just a small group that was cross-departmental to engage in developing the initial actions to address the higher risks that were identified. And so those groups also came together in a workshop. We had all the communities from across the network come together, and those groups came together, and in that workshop developed a climate vision to guide that action planning. So this is an example from Dawson Creek, and each of the communities came up with a slightly different vision based on what was important and the values there in their community. And then those climate action teams were tasked with developing a near-term action plan for each of their communities, focusing on those top risks. And we did some work in the workshops to kind of introduce that and start to work with that and outline what those actions might be and look at how we would evaluate those. And then the teams took that and did some more in-depth work back in their communities to generate a full set of initial actions. And so each of them scoped out a set of initial actions, and these actions identify both what's already happening, as we mentioned a few times, there's lots already going on, and then also any additional actions to address the gaps in reducing some of those top risks. So none of the communities are starting from scratch. All of them have things that they've been working on, and this process really brought to light new areas to focus on, and also identifies where communities might look for future funding and work where there are gaps and things that need to be further addressed. So the full list of actions for each of the communities, again, is in the full vulnerability assessment reports, and there's kind of a snapshot of those in each of the summary reports. Some of the opportunities that were identified for regional collaboration include the ones on the screen here. So flood risk management was one that a few of the communities had in common, and both Dawson Creek and Chetwynd were kind of at a similar place in their process. So there was some potential there to collaborate and share learning and approaches. In invasive species and pests would be another one where it would be interesting to kind of collaborate and look for opportunities. So working with the province or with industry on understanding these management practices for resilience, and also in local programs that might be developed would be another opportunity to learn from each other, possibly hire the same consultant and share some of the knowledge and the experience that's being developed. There's an emergency notification system that the Peace River Regional District has launched that's currently being used, and that's something that could also be expanded. So they're sharing freezing rain information and health and social wellness information on that platform already. So that's a good opportunity to expand and make further use of that. Communications materials on shared areas of concern, such as wildfire health impacts or fuel removal or different things like that, would also be an easy way to maximize the resources that are in the region, things that would be very similar from community to community. Sewage and drainage studies, that was an issue of concern in all the communities. So some of the learning and recommendations are likely to be transferable to other communities, even if they don't have the capacity to do the full study themselves at this time. Liaising with provincial ministries and industry, of course, would be something to do together, and also the process of renewing plans at various points, just sharing whatever expertise and materials and learning have been generated would improve everyone's planning. So the outcomes of this project, capacity building was one part of that, looking at engaging and raising awareness amongst the stakeholders, building the relationships and knowledge of the network members themselves so that they can continue to take leadership on this the way that they have been for the last number of years, and carry that forward. And then within the communities, the climate action teams who are now working closely with those initial actions that they've identified, and are building their capacity to also bring this forward. For each of the communities, we produced a full assessment report and also an accessible summary report. So that's shown on the right here. That was I think about a 10-pager for each of the communities, more visual and accessible, so that that's easier to use as a communications product, and also provided presentations to council to ensure that this is on people's minds, and awareness is there, so to enable staff to continue to carry this forward as well. So that's it from us, and thank you on behalf of my team, and I will pass it back to Kate.
Thank you so much, Erica. Great to hear that overview. And now I will chat a bit with Carol and Victor as municipal representatives who can share their thoughts on being a part of the Northeast Climate Risk Network. So my first panel question for you both, and maybe Carol, you can start us off on this one, is how did this project support you to understand how your community and the region will be impacted by climate change? And what are some of the priority risks identified for your community?
Hi there. Well, the community has noticed that it doesn't get as cold as it used to here in the winter, but there's still some resistance to that whole concept of climate change by the community. So I was really encouraged by the level of interest in our community during the workshops, but outside of the workshops as well. For instance, when Trevor Murdoch, a climate scientist, visited the community, we had a nice group of people show up to the public meeting, and he was able to answer their questions knowledgeably, but from a scientific background and a neutral perspective. He didn't have any investment in their farms or work or belief system, so his answers were more credible to them than from some other sources. So I really appreciated how they accepted that data that he provided, and it gave us a good idea of weather patterns that we can expect in the future here. And that allows us to plan and allocate resources where they're needed on a short, medium, and long-term basis. So some of the priority risks you asked about for Chetwynd were increased risk of riverine flooding, warmer winters because of the increased thaw and freeze cycles. We're actually seeing that right now. We have a bridge in town, and because of the freezing and thawing, we've got this ice buildup that's actually threatening to lift the bridge a little bit. So we're really keeping an eye on that, trying all kinds of different mitigation on it this week, actually. We're at risk of seeing increased intensity and frequency of rainfall events in the other seasons besides winter, which would increase our potential for flooding. Travel risks for sure. For instance, even this week we're seeing with all the freezing and thawing that the Pine Pass has been closed almost every day. Not today that I've heard of, but it's early yet. And so that's our main access to the south via Highway 97. So that really is a travel risk and a risk of isolation. Hotter summers is another risk that we are slated to see. And that could provide an increased risk to vulnerable of heat stroke, or also increase in electrical usage for air conditioning. We might see more invasive pests and plants come up here as it gets warmer, and of course wildfire and fire and drought. So those are a few of the ones that were identified during our workshop.
Yeah, thank you so much for that in-depth overview, Carol. That's really great to have your thoughts and sort of your own prioritization and community's prioritization to come through here. So Victor, would you be able to also answer that question? Would you like to me to read it out for you again, or are you good to go?
No, I'm good to go. I just want to thank everyone for being involved in this project. It's been a really good one, and we appreciate the effort that went into it and the information that we got out of it. It certainly helped us as we move forward with future plans as to what to expect and where we should focus on. So thanks for everyone for that. Over the last number of years, we've had flood, we've had drought, we've had wildfire in the area, we've had landslides and major events and roads closed and whatever. So we've done a lot of work already as we try to make the city more resilient to changes in the climate. And so we've done a lot of things already, but this has certainly helped identify where we need to go and what we could expect in the future. It's given us a better, broader idea of the municipalities, our neighbors, what their strengths are and what their concerns are, as we're a region up here, and the rain doesn't stop at the borders. So that was also important to have these connections between all the different communities. We can expect more severe weather events, more localized flooding. We've put millions of dollars into bigger pipes already, and hopefully we've taken care of a lot of that. But as we move forward, there's always things that we can look to make things better. So another thing is, as was presented, that the weather, there's going to be more rain in the fall. So this year was a perfect example of that. We had a lot of construction projects on the go, and it was hard to get them completed before the construction season ended because we just had more rain. And we had a lot of farmers also that had a lot of crops out in the fields that couldn't actually get them off because of the rain. So that's a change, which is different than the years when we had drought, which wasn't that long ago either. With larger rain events that can happen, we've got some major storm drainage channels that have erosion effects. There's potential landslides where some of our major infrastructure pipelines down to the river are located. So we really have to watch out for that. We're busy doing a slope stabilization, a slope stability study on the area right now as we speak, actually. So the warmer weather also causes us some problems. I mean, there's a longer growing season, but if the summer's drier and the one river in particular, where one of our sewer treatment plants discharge, we might not have much dilution there, so that's a concern. And of course, wildfires is always a concern in the last few years, not this year, or last year. We were an evacuation center for a number of different areas. And on top of that is just the rain on snow, which has already been mentioned, and more icing effects and just road maintenance issues that are a little different than what we typically see. Those are some of the main things for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was again a very, very comprehensive, quick deep dive. So my second question for you both, and I know that this has been answered to an extent, but maybe if there's another part of the question you'd like to answer, what has your municipality been doing that has helped to prepare for climate change? And how will the resources of the Northeast Climate Risk Network help to build on this work?
In Chetwynd, we've been trying to enhance our community wildfire preparedness. We've got a grant for an interface plan, so we're working on that to try to reduce the fuel load around town in the key interface areas. We're also working with our regional partners to provide information and education about reducing wildfire risk. And also the one issue that we've had here in the past and could probably expect more of is not actually being under threat of wildfire, although that is a risk, but the smoke quality, the poor quality of the air does affect people in the community, especially the vulnerable. So we're working on trying to figure out solutions to that. Public education, for instance, and also providing some kind of a sanctuary for clean air. We don't have an air quality monitor in town, so that's one thing that we're lobbying the government to get us an air quality monitor so that we can tell besides just what we can see and smell when the air is not good, especially for people with asthma or other risk factors. We're responding to increased frequency and intensity of precipitation by adding a climate lens to our stormwater infrastructure and planning. So as we replace our aging infrastructure, we're trying to build not for the weather we've got now, but the weather that we can expect in the future. So we're trying to adapt to climate change that way. we're also engaging residents on improvements and the ways that they can mitigate their own risk factors. And we're also, of course, risk of flooding is pretty high on our risk level, on our list of risks. So we're trying to mitigate flooding in our area. That's something that's kind of unique to Chetwynd and probably Dawson Creek as well. We completed some flood hazard mapping and a plan, and we're seeking funding for implementation of structural mitigation. So that's an ongoing project. We're also trying to prepare for the extreme weather events by continuing to work on invasive species management with the Peace River Regional District and other partners, improving our understanding of landslide risk, because there hasn't been a great deal of landslide monitoring here to this point, and we're incorporating considerations of changing climate and associated impacts into our asset management planning, which is also ongoing.
Wonderful, thank you. And Victor, how about yourself?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, we've done some work, particularly around stormwater management. We're not in a river valley. We're actually on top. The Peace River Valley is thankfully close by. It's our water supply, but it is a 300-meter deep valley that we're beside. So our drainage courses are quite steep and getting water out and sewer effluent back down to them definitely causes some challenges. So we've done long-term water supply plan, how we plan to move forward into the future with water supply, our stormwater master plan, and the projects that came out of that to help solve one of the pictures that was actually presented there earlier. And I think we've mitigated that fairly well. We've done a lot of things around water conservation as well, metering and full cost recovery rates, just to help me mitigate water usage. We've done a lot of work on the OCP, through the OCP, and changing our subdivision servicing standards to apply to a newer reality than what we have based things on in the past. And you know, we've also promoted things like we've built a passive house to help encourage different, better housing strategies and housing models. We worked with BC Housing and BC Hydro to build a 50-unit passive apartment, which is the largest of its kind in the province. Our new RCMP detachment is being built towards net zero standards as well. So we're moving the whole building envelope standard to a higher level so that it takes less to heat or less to cool. So those are all some things that we've been doing as well. And just every time we rebuild a road, or we're looking at the systems and we're increasing or improving the capacity of our infrastructure that's under it or on it, so that it's better to meet the newer reality.
It's really inspiring to hear all the work that's being done. Thank you both. My third question, Carol, I'll start with you again. What difference does it make to work as a region or network on this project? Were there any opportunities or insights that wouldn't have been there if you'd done it alone?
Oh yeah, I think there were a lot of opportunities and insights. You know, talking with somebody as experienced as Victor, for instance, you really find a lot of knowledge in communities that have people that are, or the communities are undergoing different things than we are. Some of the things that we weren't worried about, like one of the things we weren't worried about was wildfire, because we had a consultant do a report on our risk, or do a risk assessment. And the report said that we weren't in danger from wildfire because we're surrounded by deciduous forests, mostly aspen. But talking to Victor and some other people from Port St. John, they talked about how their community had interface fires and how that happened in a grass field. So you don't need trees to have a fire that can threaten your community. So that was a good learning experience. One of the things we were worried about was our access to water for the community, and that turned out not to be as big a risk as we thought, because the climate projections showed that our community's water source, which is the Pine River, will actually be a bit higher than it is now. So we're probably not as at risk for water shortages we thought we were. However, we're still trying to develop our water capacity and storage for the community in case of drought. But it's been a really eye-opening experience, and I'm really, really glad that we had the opportunity to go through it.
That's great. That's really good to hear. And Victor, yourself, difference that it makes to work as a region or network on the project, and any opportunities or insights that wouldn't have been there if you'd done it alone.
Well, this region really is a special part of the province, and our neighbors are definitely where our support comes from. So as we go through, whether it's a wildfire evacuation or some major event where you need some help, knowing the person down at the next community is a great asset, just to be able to call them up, ask for their help, support them. The regional district, we provided a lot of support for their EOC when they had a long-term event go on. So the regional district wasn't part of this network, but just that's one of the things that we're looking at. And I guess that's maybe the next question, is just helping expand this a little bit to other players as well. So basically knowing what the other communities' needs are, what their strengths are, and just a face really does add a lot of difference. See, as I mentioned earlier, rain or snow, those things don't stop at municipal boundaries. So those are some of the really good things that came out of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard that pretty strongly through our various meetings. It's great. So final question before we head to general Q&A with the audience. Any key lessons and takeaways other than what you've already talked about? Carol, would you like to start with that?
Well, I think I probably already went on about it quite a bit, but one of the key lessons was just how similar the different municipalities in our region are, and the challenges that we all share. A lot of the things that we have been dealing with on our own, we found that the other municipalities in the region are also dealing with them. So being able to share that information was really valuable. You mentioned that we have a platform for emergency notification. So that's a regional initiative that we're happy to tap into, and now we can, if there is something going on in the region, we can alert all of the people in the whole region if we wanted to, or just one street or one neighborhood. So that's just one example of how working together we were able to come up with something that could really have a huge benefit for our entire region. So I guess one of my key takeaways is just that it's really good to meet with your municipal neighbors and talk about what your issues and challenges are, because it's surprising how many solutions you can come up with together. And, you know, some of them talk about practical solutions they've found to issues that we're facing that we never even thought of. So it's been a really valuable exercise.
Great, great. And yourself, Victor, any key lessons and takeaways other than what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, well, I'll mention some of them again just because they were key. Is just the fact of looking at your whole system, getting different departments from your own city together for starters, just to look at how climate might impact things, how your systems might be impacted, what's your strength and weakness, what actually have a plan and exercise around what you're doing and where you might be vulnerable. So for our own municipality, that was really good to have that time just to sit and think about what are our risks and what will make us more resilient by improving something. And then of course, meeting with our neighbors, and as we move forward from here to make the region more resilient, is just who do we need to just bring in every now and again to talk with on a regional level, that like the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure or the regional district or some of the other utility companies, just to see where they're at and also what their plans may be as well. So that's sort of a move forward basis.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for your very in-depth and detailed answers to these panel questions. I've seen some questions come that are already directed to you too, so I will call on you again soon. But in the meantime, I wanted to give that super brief overview of the Northeast Climate Risk Network Steps Forward that I mentioned previously. So this is a picture that was taken yesterday at Fort St. John during our meeting of the Northeast Climate Risk Network. Just an overview, so Friday is when the official period ends that was originally determined. January 2020 is the end of the first 2 years. And at this workshop, it was determined that the network members would like to move forward in some form, although what was also determined was that they needed a bit more time to sort of look through the results that had already been created, and based on that, sort of determine how to move forward together. At the very baseline, what was very interesting was something, Carol, you just mentioned, coming up with solutions together and sharing those solutions to save time and money, and also to build those really important connections between communities that both of you were talking about. So that's sort of the very general sketch that I can give. There will likely be a meeting in the next 6 to 8 months again. And at that time, if anybody's interested, I can give them another update on where things are heading. So now we can move to audience Q&A, and I see some has come in. So Jim, I'll pass it to you to put up the slide so I can see the questions. So the first question, which I can answer, was with planning community vulnerabilities and reaching out to stakeholder working groups, were First Nations involved with the process? What were those outcomes and where can that information be found? So, so I'll answer this as 2 questions, and if they should be more linked, let me know. But the first question, were First Nations involved? We inquired as to using the funding to partner with First Nations as well. And we were informed that the funding could not be used past the municipal partners. So that was not part of the first 2 years, although it is something that we discussed quite a bit yesterday at our meeting, and potentially something that we will move forward with. I think based on what was expressed yesterday on broadening, potentially broadening the network, I think that that is a big possibility. So, and then for the question, what were those outcomes and where can that information be found? I think that you're probably meaning the general reports that were produced. So the Regional Climate Projections Report can be found on the Fraser Basin Council website, and Jim sent that out in the chat. And the vulnerability assessments were given to each community themselves. So likely you'd have to connect with them to make sure that they're all right with giving that out. So my second question is for the community members. And this one is a good one. What would you do differently, Carol and Victor, if you were starting this all over again?
I guess what I would do, because we had a hard time getting the community to attend the public engagement sessions, so I guess I would probably, instead of putting it out just to the public, I would probably go to the individual organizations and invite them personally to try to get more buy-in that way. But on the First Nations question, I just wanted to mention that we did extend personal invitations to them to attend our workshops, and we did have some participation that way. So they might not have come up with their own vulnerability assessment, but we're really close with our First Nations partners, so a lot of them live in our community, so they were involved in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for us, we did have a much broader group that came in for a workshop or two, which was really good. And we had really pretty heavy involvement with plan and engineering, public works. Not quite as much involvement with the protective services branch in town. I think just right off the bat, I would have probably invited someone from them to be part of the network as well, just because of the real connection with protective services.
Okay, perfect. Thank you both. And a question for Shift. Based on your work with various communities around BC on climate resilience, what made the work with the Northeast Climate Risk Network unique or different?
I can try that, and then Tamsin, you could maybe chime in too. So one of the things that was different was actually doing 6 all at once. So it was an interesting process to see how that went and sort of some of the pros and cons of doing it that way. There was a lot of richness that came from doing all of the communities at one time and a lot of overlap, which we anticipated. But it was a little bit different because we weren't able to go as deeply into each community as we might have otherwise. And I think there's, in terms of the risks that are being faced, a lot of them are very similar to other places. So there's a lot that's transferable. But then in another sense, the Northeast region, as Victor was mentioning, is very interconnected unto itself. So that was an interesting part of doing this work, was better understanding the ways that the region functions as a system unto itself, and some of the impacts reflect that.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with Erica and add that then obviously the network component, doing it on a regional basis, is pretty unique. And I think it was really interesting to see the strengths and challenges of doing work across a region. I think the communities were very in tune with impacts, what they'd seen and what they anticipated to see. And I think the transportation corridors and potential isolation was regionally unique compared to, say, municipalities in the South Coast or Okanagan.
That's really interesting. Thank you both. Victor and Carol, another question for you. What advice would you have for other communities that are just beginning climate resilience work?
I would, from my perspective, I would say to have a really good look at what you're doing right now, and because all of us in BC have aging infrastructure, and so we're always trying to replace that and build capacity. So I think it's really good to look at what you're doing right, so that you don't waste your resources. But when you go to replace your aging infrastructure, build for the future weather patterns, so that you don't have to redo it later. And that can include some of your policies like OCPs and zoning bylaws as well. If you include looking at those with a climate lens, it really will affect everything. So everything that we do, we should really be looking at with a climate lens going forward. So I think that's important, to find a baseline and then to expand so that you know that you'll be okay in the years to come with what you're building now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Carol answered that really well. Certainly, we've been working towards bigger pipes and new realities for a while, and anybody that is already doing this work in other communities will know where their weak points are, for starters. And as they look at new projects and new things and new developments, they can just think about what volumes they need to deal with, drainage courses, whatever it might be that needs to happen, fire separations and fire safe situations. Yeah, look at those things every time you look at a new project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Shift, another question for Erica and Tamsin. Have you worked with other networks based on what you were just talking about it being unique and that it was a network? Have you worked with other networks before, or do you know of other network examples that have addressed climate resilience?
Tamsin, I'll pass that one to you.
Sure. I haven't worked with a network of municipalities like this before. It's pretty unique. There are adaptation collaboratives across the US that are very well respected for the work they do. If you look sort of in the Florida area, as well as around Arizona, there are adaptation collaboratives, which are regional groupings of municipalities and other stakeholders and actors.
Great, thank you. And so Carol, you mentioned that potentially not all people in communities are really on side with thinking about climate change, which is the case for all communities. But could you answer the question, yourself and Victor, do you have any advice for working with community stakeholders who may be skeptical about climate change?
Well, as I mentioned, when the climate scientist Trevor came to town, he had such a good public engagement session, because he has no investment in, whether they, what they believe or their jobs or whatever. All he cared about was the science, and you could just tell he's so enthusiastic about the data and the models that they had used. So it's really good to get a neutral person into your community to speak to the public, so that they don't think it's coming from you. You don't have, this person has no stake in it. All they're doing is sharing information, and it really helped people to realize that it is happening. If you look at the stats, there's no doubt the statistics don't lie. And all the questions they asked, oh, did you allow for this or did you allow for that? He was able to answer knowledgeably and with science background. So I think that was really the most valuable thing we could have done for those folks.
Mm-hmm. Victor, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, the climate projection report was really done well, and we presented it to council and had a full hour committee of the whole meeting, and council got to look at it, go through it, really quite in depth. That was a good information session, basically, but we had the climate projection already. So I guess to answer part of the question is just get that work done first, and then see where you go from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Erica or Tamsin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that it's not necessary for people to actually believe that climate change is happening to engage effectively in this type of a process. And we certainly encountered that in a number of the communities. Not everyone who was there necessarily was bought into the idea that climate change was happening in the way that it was spoken of. However, it really doesn't matter. You can really just start from the impacts that people are experiencing already, and then people will relate to it, and it doesn't even matter if they believe that emissions are causing it or exactly what's going to happen in the future. If people can relate to it in that sense, then we've found that they're very engaged in the conversations and it's relevant and meaningful to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tamsin, would you like to add anything to that as someone who's likely experienced this before quite a bit as well?
Well, I agree with Erica. I think focusing on preparedness for natural hazards that are going to potentially worsen can sidestep going into the weeds about the causes of climate change or what exactly is happening.
Great, thank you all. My last question, unless anybody from the audience would like to ask any more, feel free to type those in. But the last one so far is going back to Erica, your talks about climate change impacts. You mentioned that health and economic impacts were not delved into too much. Do you have any examples of vulnerability assessments that focus more on health that have been done by communities?
I could definitely provide some of those, perhaps as a follow-up. I definitely have a lot of resources around that I could share. There's quite a bit of of work going on now in BC and Canada, just the last year or two. That's been increasing a lot. So there's a number of examples now, and also there's a few places in the States that have been doing that for a bit longer. Oregon comes to mind. So yeah, there's quite a few examples that I could provide after. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add to that as well, and I will be sending out the information about this webinar, and with permission of the two PowerPoint presenters, Tamsin and Erica, I will send out their presentations as well, and can send out the resources that Erica was talking about. And I'll also mention that something that might be interesting to look into, if it hasn't already been seen, is the work of the Swinomish Indian tribal community on their climate change initiative, which has a more holistic sort of look at health as a part of climate change impacts. So it's a very, very, very cool project to look into. So seeing no more, sorry?
Sorry, hi Kate, it's
Yeah.
Tamsin. I have a few things on the health side.
Oh, of course, thank you so much.
Health Canada has done some health vulnerability assessments, piloted those across Canada, and those are available through their website, and specific to the South Coast, but I think an interesting project, Vancouver Coastal Health worked with UBC, and they're just about to publish spatial information on the impacts to health from climate change. So looking at where the highest vulnerabilities may be to certain impacts.
Great, thank you. Thank you for interrupting me there. I should have given you a chance to answer that as well. So thank you to our 4 wonderful presenters and panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk about the Northeast Climate Risk Network today. The name may be changing. We will keep you all updated, but based on our discussion yesterday, it may have a slight name change in the future. But thank you everyone who attended as well, and for your questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day. This one will be posted online and everything will be sent out as well.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.